much. It's really a pleasure. Oh, it's really a pleasure to be here together with the voice telling me that the meeting is being recorded, and also with the rest of you. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into this talk. And so the object of my talk today is to sort of draw together some historical findings, some linguistic findings, some experimental findings, to talk about a range of phenomena that may not be all new to you, or none of them may be new to you, but hopefully I'm bringing them together in a coherent way that will be newly informative and useful. So, and I would love for one of the things to come out of this kind of largely descriptive and summative overview would be to leap into, to talk to all of you about methods in data science for engaging with these phenomena in a new way. So that's, but before we do that, I think it's really good to get the lay of the land, and that's the plan here. Okay, so to kick things off, as I'm sure all of you know, there's a long and lively tradition in linguistics and in literary studies and film studies for comparing the resources available for reporting speech, reporting thought, perception across different modalities and different media. And so we want to know when and how different kinds of discourse might do, in some sense, the same kinds of things. And lots of us, including me, certainly, are especially interested in doing this kind of comparative work in cases where the status of that representation, right, an embedded representation, is unstable or ambiguous or in some way mixed. These are really interesting cases. So, for example, free indirect discourse is relatively rare in conversation, and for a long time, actually, people resolutely believed that it didn't exist in conversation, but that turns out not to be true. It occurs in oral narratives and many other settings as well, and it's been interesting to explore that. And mixed viewpoint constructions of all sorts really show up all over the place. And the more multimodal work we do, the more we see that that's the case. So, for example, speakers often produce gestures that express a different viewpoint from the one that they're doing in speech, or even express more than one viewpoint at the same time. Signed languages also offer lots of resources for presenting multiple perspectives in a single utterance. People conjure up multiple viewpoints in monologic settings through fictive interaction, and they do this in various ways across media. Comics and film offer loads of opportunities to blend multiple viewpoints in a single moment. So overall, the more that we've looked, the more clear it's become that constructions that evoke multiple viewpoints at once, or that evoke some parts of a viewpoint while not evoking other parts, things like this, are all over the place. So the other thread of the talk so that's one thing that we'll be talking about today. And the other thread comes from my ongoing work on narrative surprise and on various kinds of sort of what we call uncooperative discourse genres, or cooperative uncooperativity, like puzzles, ironic banter, mystery stories, and things like this. So my book, Elements of Surprise, looks at how stories capitalize on various predictable aspects of the way that people think to pull off surprises. Biases in memory, reasoning, taking advantage of these to encourage us to lose track of the context in which we learn some story critical information, only to bring it back in later on. And some of the same biases also serve to kind of make good enough fits late in a story feel really inevitable. But a lot of these same tricks, I want to concentrate on the fact that these tricks rely really heavily on medium-specific conventions around how character viewpoints are represented and how character discourse is represented. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So specifically, especially thrillers and mystery stories across media very often exploit structures and conventions that offer what we could call subjective ambiguity. So for example, in a novel, if you want to be clever, you could present a passage that's readily compatible with an interpretation that makes it seem to be attributable to an omniscient narrator, or, you know, in some sense to the base level of the narrative itself, but is also written in such a way that it can turn out to have been the fallible or dishonest account of a character. So this kind of structure provides a really useful opportunity to set up surprise twists. while maintaining the informational integrity of the baseline narrative. That is, it's a way to mislead without having it count as a lie, right? Then the narrative hasn't been inconsistent or dishonest. A character has been. And stories really do quite often take advantage of that opportunity. And the fact that they do this, that in itself constitutes interesting data about the constructions that they use to do that, because these patterns of narrative sleight of hand tell us something important about how available the different relevant interpretations potentially are to people. You know, how backgrounded they may be in the moment, but available later on, right? That they're latent but not completely out of the picture, to bring up and have be part of the payoff. And we'll come back to that idea as we go on. Now, the conventions around the degree to which we're supposed to attribute material to a character whose viewpoint has been invoked are not the same for written narratives as they are for films in the Hollywood tradition, which is what I'll be talking about today. So for instance, it's very common for Hollywood style films to use character speech or other representations of their perspective as the jumping off point to set up a flashback, or to help viewers stay oriented in space and time between edits, only to completely, you know, jettison the constraints of character viewpoint once that transition has been established. So in service of continuity, without retaining a kind of obligation to be consistent with character viewpoint after that. So I'm going to take a look at some of these sorts of what I'm calling vanishing viewpoints. And we'll discuss also the challenges that these diverging conventions present to creating unified multimodal accounts of concepts like pre-indirect discourse, narrative embedding, and the like, which we would like to be able to do, but you know, we have to be nuanced in our approach. So here's the plan. I'm going to take us through some conventions around character viewpoint as a forgettable, we might call it, element in each of the devices that you see here in our slide. I'll give you some examples of how they play out in both sort of straight and as ambiguities to be exploited for tricky effect, sort of the affordances that they offer for doing this. And then we'll spend some time after we've gone through all 4 of these on the question of what we know about how much of an impression these vanishing viewpoints leave on us. So I'm going to talk some about free indirect discourse. I'm not going to spend nearly as much, I mean, you know, I could spend hours talking about free indirect discourse in text and in speech, because there's so much to say and there's so much that has been said. But sort of in brief, if you want to do some kind of plot-related sleight of hand by under-specifying when a viewpoint shift has occurred in your narrative, free indirect discourse offers a great way to do it. So just to take a minute to sort of what is free indirect discourse, which will be a review for most of you, so we'll do this quickly. But as you probably know, right, within a stretch of text or of speech, direct speech and thought presents a demonstration or quotation of what someone else has said or thought, right, or your past self or whatever. Indirect discourse, by contrast, right, provides descriptions, you might say, rather than dramatizations of a person's words or thoughts. So, you know, that's the difference between direct discourse. He said, "I can't see you tomorrow," versus he said that he couldn't see her the following day, or something like that, indirect. But there's also quite a lot of flexibility, right, in terms of the forms that indirect speech and indirect thought, right, indirect discourse can take. And narratives can also provide quite a lot less in the way of explicit markers of whose words or thoughts are being presented at a given moment, right? So free indirect forms combine elements of direct and indirect discourse. They allow character and narrator viewpoints to intermingle, and they allow for embedded viewpoints to kind of pop in and out of view. So let's take a look. So these are some examples from P.D. James from a 1972 mystery novel, An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. And the situation here is Cordelia Gray is the detective. She's a young private detective who's investigating the apparent suicide of Mark Callender, who was a Cambridge undergraduate. So you look at these 3 examples, who are we supposed to hold responsible for the opinions that are presented in the final sentence of each of these passages, right? So in the first two cases, the assessment in the underlined bit seems to belong to Cordelia, right? So it's Cordelia who thinks that the he of the first passage is a police sergeant. It's Cordelia who thinks that he didn't need the photo to prove his argument, right? Most likely, it's easy to attribute it that way. It also seems to be Cordelia who believes in the second case that Isabel couldn't have murdered Mark. So these claims aren't explicitly marked off as Cordelia's own. They aren't introduced within their own sentences with a reporting tag like she decided or she thought, but we readily interpret them as part of her ongoing internal analysis. So if it turned out later that these assessments were wrong, right, it was necessary to prove his argument. Isabel could have murdered Mark. Those would be mistakes on Cordelia's part rather than an inconsistency in the sort of baseline narrative. But the last example is structurally more or less identical to the first two, but it's not quite the same. And especially once I tell you about the overall context. So the underlined sentence could be interpreted as free indirect discourse, just like the others. But in context, it becomes clear that Cordelia is not in that moment conscious of her own danger of being lulled into a gentle acceptance of defeat. So that assessment is an observation on the part of the main narrative about something that Cordelia is explicitly not aware of, or there wouldn't be this danger, right? Later, when she's looking back on this moment, we get to see her realize the danger that she was in. So her, viewpoints can, now you see it, now you don't, right? And stories can introduce misleading information this way under the radar, but still have the option available to take it back. So surprise, it was just Barbara in this first example who thought Lady Helen was Linley's mistress, and this is the source of a surprise later in the narrative. Humor, it's only Emma who thinks that Harriet, her friend Harriet, has any relevant emotion to betray, right? She thinks Harriet is in love, but she's not. And text processing research suggests that overall readers think about questions about who knows what and who said what like this in a text largely on an on-needed basis. And engaged readers also tend to fuse various potential participants in the literary discourse event. But as you can see from the fact that these are available for the source of a twist or a joke, the viewpointedness of these expressions doesn't vanish altogether, as it remains available to invoke when necessary. So that as-needed basis is still possible. Okay, so what about film? Let's take a look. The conventions of classic Hollywood-style continuity editing, which were developed over the course of the 20th century, comprise a sort of suite of standard methods, principles, heuristics for keeping viewers oriented in space and in time to produce this sense of a unified or continuous narrative progression across cuts. So the object of this style is to lead viewers without much or any conscious effort to, just knit disparate elements together across cuts and have it feel like a smooth and coherent whole. So you can think of these techniques as strategies that serve crucially to cue viewer attention across a cut, right? That these are lots of strategies that keep your attention cued across a cut to put our attention in the right place at the right time to support a sense of continuity where it's wanted. And perhaps unsurprisingly, a resource that's really, 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 really useful for this purpose is the on-screen representation of character viewpoint, because people pay a lot of attention to what other people are looking at and paying attention to. So in an eyeline match edit like what you see here, one shot presents a character looking at something outside the frame of the shot, and then it's preceded or followed by a shot that's presenting the scene space, right? So that, and this is a matter of both convention and it's conventions that capitalize on our natural tendencies, right? So that a practiced viewer of Hollywood style films understand, you see somebody looking off screen here, I'm gesturing to my screen even though you can't see it, is that then there's a cut to this coffee cup that he's looking at the coffee cup. Sometimes, but definitely not necessarily from the exact vantage of the viewing character, right? So he's looking at this coffee cup, but not from the angle at which we see it here, but that's not a problem, right? That's not, by convention and by norms, our experiences that we understand that he's looking at the coffee cup, even though we're seeing it from a different vantage than he is, right? Sometimes these cuts do set up fully depictive character viewpoint shots, as in this clip from Double Indemnity, where you can practically, hear the as Fred McMurray watches her descend, and you know that he's attending to her legs before anything else. But more often, the physical arrangement of characters' lines of sight serves to provide an organizing logic and coherence to a scene without suggesting that any of those shots should be taken as depicting character viewpoints in a strict sense. So for instance, a very standard Hollywood approach to staging dialogue scenes is to show one character looking at another, usually, off screen, off shot, cross-cut with shots of the other character looking back at the first. So this is the shot, reverse shot position. And there's other conventions around sort of how you can organize them in space. So keeping the 180-degree rule, for example, about these angles. But you'll notice the camera is typically to one side of where the other character's viewpoint. So the character's viewpoints and the character's physical gaze organizes this shot, but the camera is never standing in exactly for either of these characters. And it doesn't generate the implication that any of these shots constitutes a strict representation of the point of view of any of the characters in the scene. And similarly, eyeline match shots cue us to physical and attentional connections between elements in a scene. And in doing this, they rely on our tendency to notice gaze direction, our inclination to draw inferences based on assumptions of relevance, and so on. So in continuity editing, the composition of shots is very often structured with very close reference to character viewpoint and gaze, but what's shown on screen needn't and typically doesn't have the status of direct representation, right? By convention, doesn't have the status of direct representation of the character's perceptions. And also, we'll review some of this research a little bit later on. People don't tend to remember these shots as belonging to a character either, unless it's really heavily foregrounded. So I'll talk a little bit more about that research in a bit, but I just wanted to put a pin in that. When scenes withhold an eyeline match, that can be very noticeable. It generates tension, it enhances suspense, as Todd Oakley and I have shown in some research from 2012. Viewpoint in these film constructions, so you see here, this is a scene from Notorious that is really structured around Ingrid Bergman's character failing to look at the coffee cup that has been poisoned that she's been drinking from. And so viewpoint in these film constructions, those that I showed you so far, it's enacted on a relatively small scale, although they can be built together right into long scale sequences in a scene, as in this sequence in Notorious. So they keep us informed about characters' reactions, they keep us oriented in space and time. They're sort of the equivalent of sentence or clause level constructions, and they're that kind of viewpointing in language. But of course, okay, so fine. Narrators also offer resources for embedding whole extended swaths of character discourse as well, right? So not just visual viewpoint and that sort of thing, perceptual embedding or perceptual viewpointedness, but actually attributed discourse. So let's take a look at those. So in the classic Hollywood studio style, flashbacks are commonly very often cued with one of two devices. So you might have a scene in which a character is recalling events, I remember, right? Or one in which a character is explaining the past to another. And then after these conventions are established and sort of normalized in the so-called enhanced continuity style of post-1970s Hollywood films, you get abbreviated versions of these cues, which we'll be seeing an example of later on when I'm talking about in combination with some other cues when I'm talking about film sound. So keep an eye open for that. The character's reminiscences or speech or even gaze can orient us toward an upcoming flashback with just an eyeline shot leading into the new scene. But the thing that I want to talk about here is that the ensuing flashback scenes conventionally proceed with a level of detail and cinematic structure that far exceeds the bounds of what the cueing narrative or memory could reasonably include, right? It's hard to avoid because there are sort of requirements of how you present a scene on screen that mean that it necessarily unfolds with a level of detail that far exceeds that of what somebody reporting could include, or what somebody remembering would be likely to include. David Bordwell puts it, he says, this happens without scandal. As a matter of convention, we just handle it. So a scene showing a character launching on some tale prompts our understanding that what follows is a flashback, fine. And then it doesn't matter that nobody could tell an event with the level of detail that the flashback includes. Or that, for example, you have a third person vantage of this and you see that the back of the character's coat is dusty, right? And this is information that you have and you take it to be veridical, even though the character couldn't be remembering it for herself or whatever. Now, when the needs of a story require it, though, the fact that a flashback belongs to some character can absolutely be pressed into service. So the usual suspects, sorry, spoilers, everybody, if, big spoilers, it famously takes advantage of this possibility to set up its final surprise twist, which is that Kevin Spacey's character's testimony, and that therefore also the flashbacks that dramatized it and sort of take up the bulk of the film were fabrications from start to finish. So this is possible, but it is by far the exception rather than the rule. And so going back to David Bordwell's point that more conventionally, the sort of disconnect between what a character could know and what a character could see, what a character might be saying, and the content of a flashback, that this diverges without scandal and by convention. He points out a really great illustrative example of how the flashback motivating viewpoint vanishes with a flashback in an example from the film 10 North Frederick. So this is also a film that takes place mostly in flashback. It is framed, so Gary Cooper's character, Joe, has died, and it begins with his funeral, and his adult children sort of escape upstairs to get away from the funeral, and Anne, who you see here, is reminiscing about Joe's life, and this is what sort of kicks us off into this extended sequence of flashbacks about Joe and how he became the man that he is. So lots and lots of things happen in these flashbacks that Anne could absolutely not have known. There's sequences she wasn't there for, things that were secrets that are included that we see unfold before us. But the best bit is that the sequence is supposedly her embedded reminiscence tells us something that it turns out she remains utterly unaware of. Like, not just stuff that incidentally she doesn't remain aware, that she doesn't know about, but that is kind of crucial. So let me tell you what happens. So there's the flashback follows Joe as he falls in love with a model named Kate. They have an affair, but Kate leaves him. And this all happens, several years before the events that are the latest parts of his life that Anne reminisces about. But in the wake of Kate leaving him, Joe descends into alcoholism and becomes this kind of quiet drunk. And in the climactic scene of the flashback, 5 years after Kate has left him, there's a scene where he's sitting in an armchair and Anne comes in and talks to him. He's drinking. They talk. Anne leaves the room. The flashback stays with Joe. He closes his eyes. And then we hear his subjective auditory flashback, right? We have this flashback within a flashback, and this is really subjectively him. He hears Kate's voice repeating from his past, "Good night, my love." And then he collapses and drops the glass, and this is the end of the larger flashback. We come in on Anne's face, cueing the idea that this is the end of her reminiscence. Fine. And then in an epilogue, this is the fun part, Anne is a bridesmaid at Kate's wedding. And at that wedding, she suddenly realizes that Kate and her father have been lovers. This is her climactic realization. She says, "Oh, now I understand it all, Kate." She hasn't realized this until the final scene. We already knew it, but we learned it in her flashback, right? And all of this is like no problem, right? As it's not scandalous, it's not incoherent, it's all in keeping with the rules of how flashbacks work in Hollywood cinema. It's fine. The flashback belongs to Anne only insofar as it needs to, and it can diverge enormously from that. Okay, so that's sort of thinking about this with flashback for now. Now I want to talk a little bit about film sound. So with film sound, there's a three-way distinction. There's extra diegetic sound, right? Sound that's on the soundtrack that isn't supposed to be audible to any of the characters. It's not really happening in the scene, right? Diegetic sound, which is supposed to be representative of the sounds that are in the scene, and also subjective or interior sound. So if you have sounds, like this is like the point of view shot in a camera angle, right? So there's something interesting to talk about here that I want to take a minute about, which is, first of all, when we study multimodal discourse in communication, sound is actually like pretty boring and straightforward. You know, you can do more than one thing at once to a certain extent with sound because there's prosody, but compared to the kinds of multivalent deictic viewpointing structures that are available and built into the modality of gesture and sign, like sound seems like really monovalent, right, compared to what's happening with the kinds of things that we can do with bodies, with, you know, gaze and posture and hand position and so on. But so the communicative resources of sound for representing viewpoint are not totally one track, but they're relatively scanty. In film, the story is very different, right? In a film soundtrack, any number of different sounds can be stacked on top of one another. Overlapping sounds can be situated at the same narrative level, different narrative levels simultaneously. They can line up with or diverge from the viewpoints visible or implicit on screen. Extra-diegetic orchestral music can play at the same time as dialogue. Sound effects syncs to events on screen. And they can switch status midstream. So for example, a really standard version of this is music being sung or played on screen diegetically, crossfades into orchestral score and becomes extra diegetic sort of seamlessly. This happens really often and unremarkably without scandal, you might say, at the end of films. So it's a lot. So let's talk about sound and continuity. Diegetic sound, which is to say that the sound that seems to originate from the depicted cinematic space, enhances continuity across cuts. There are a number of nice studies showing that this effect is, we learn this effect, and it helps, you know, we internalize it, and that experienced film viewers experience, you know, it helps cue experienced film viewers especially, but that even first-time film viewers, diegetic sound carrying across cuts enhances continuity across cuts and helps people to orient. And even subjective sound, right, internal sound serves to orient us, serves continuity purposes. It orients us in space, it orients us in psychology. We feel uptight and close to a character when we hear what she hears, right, like her breathing or her heart pounding in her ears, and so on. And I have a number of other things on here that I won't go through one by one for reasons of time. Okay, so sound very much works. Sound design is relatively unmonitored. So there's a lot that people don't notice. It does a lot of work to help keep people oriented in space and time, but it also can serve as a resource. The viewpointedness of sound can also sometimes serve as a resource for the kinds of twist exploitations that we've been looking at in sort of counterpoint to these continuity uses. So I've written a lot about subjective ambiguity and sound design in this film, The Conversation, which is about a surveillance expert, Harry Call, who's working on a particularly difficult bit of audio reconstruction. And I'll play a little bit of this for you in a second. So for about the first third of the film, the snippet that he's working on is indecipherable. So we see and hear over and over again the process of juxtaposing and combining the information from a number of different tapes. He has a number of different recordings that he's trying to sort of clean up together here until eventually words emerge from the muddle. And I'll play the emerging sound bit in a sec. When he hears this bit that you're about to hear, Harry immediately begins to suspect that the girl on the tape and the young man are having an affair, that the director, this character called the director, who's hired him to do this surveillance, who's her husband, plans on killing them as revenge. And he's very anxious about this. It triggers some bad past experiences for him. And he's worried that he's endangered their lives. So let's take this.
Kill us if he got the chance.
Okay. Oh no. Later, in the scene's final moments, Harry realizes that his interpretation of this bit of sound was wrong. And we hear, as he does, you'll see this is this kind of very 1970s enhanced abbreviated cue. We see him remember or retrospect and hear, as he does, a new version of the recording.
Do you think we can do this?
Later in the week. Sunday, maybe.
Sunday, definitely.
Jack Tar Hotel. 3 o'clock. Room 773. He'd kill us if he got the chance.
Okay. These are separated by quite a lot of time in the film. You just heard them back to back. Let me just tell you right now, this is a different recording from the one that we heard originally. It's not a cleaned up version of the same clip. It's an entirely new one that had a different line reading. So the film sound director, Walter Murch, he put it, okay, in this moment, the audience suddenly learns that the film has been, here I'm quoting Murch, wholly and singularly made from Harry's point of view, when most unexpectedly, we discover that Harry has all along mentally altered the cadence of the line. Now, using two different performances of this line was risky, right? And Murch acknowledged this because why is it risky? It threatened a fundamental premise of the film, which is that the conversation itself remained the same while your interpretation of it changes. But it was really crucial to do this. Test audiences found this version of the film much, much, much clearer, more satisfying, more comprehensible than earlier edits that didn't pull this switcheroo. So why? Because all of the viewpoint cues that the filmmakers piled on, and there are many, they're too easily assimilated to continuity. They were too difficult to access for reinterpretation without a really, really overt set of cues. So under this kind of circumstance, audiences need very salient cues, highly foregrounded, that draw attention to character viewpoint and make the contrast really explicit in order to trigger the new conscious reframing. Once you do it, though, it is effective. So experimental data shows that these sorts of viewpoint representations really do vanish for viewers, or at least you may, at the very least, say that they're very self-effacing. I feel like that might be a better way to put it, that these are very self-effacing cues. When we look at what people retain when they're asked to recount scenes that they've watched, as well as when we look at fMRI data, eye tracking data, all of these suggest that continuity editing techniques, including gaze alignment, other viewpoint cues, and even these kinds of frames that claim to set up embedded narratives, typically serve primarily to smooth over discontinuities of edits to support effective event segmentation rather than to draw attention to character subjectivity. So if viewpoints really do vanish readily when they're deployed in this way, what do I want you to do with this? what do we do with this information? Well, so first of all, it means that we should be wary of thinking of filmic structures like these as truly parallel to the most obvious analogs in written narratives, right? So flashback sequences in written narratives tend to be much more strictly tied to the character's viewpoint, although still with some points of ambiguity, than flashbacks in film sequences. Flashback in film sequences are much more mixed, much more ambiguous, much less strictly tied to character viewpoint. So the conventions around represented embedded character viewpoints in film and prose are quite different. partially as a consequence of these sort of relentless on-screen requirements of film, right? You know, in prose, language offers the opportunity, for example, for you to be quite variable along the axis of construal of specificity. But if you have, but you can just say, you know, there were a whole lot, you know, many people walked by. In a film, if you want to show many people walking by, there's real, you have to take real people and hire them and show them on screen. So, you know, these kinds of differences in the affordances and requirements of the media are part of what drives this, I think. But anytime you see something on screen that purports to be a dramatization of or a depiction of, in some sense, a quotation of what a character said or thought, by convention and by habit, you're going to grant that lots and lots of what you're seeing and hearing isn't supposed to be strictly attributed to that character. It just isn't, and it would be an error to think otherwise. And indeed, people by default generally don't do that kind of attribution in practice, as we've seen. So now, in my final moments, I want to talk about, you know, what the implications of this sort of set of facts might be for our future research. I think we're at a good moment to take our current state of knowledge about continuity strategies in film, how they're processed, and how they are and are not parallel to viewpointing structures in language, and do a couple of things with this. So for one thing, other media, of course, really, film scholars and people who study cognition in film have been doing a lot of work to sort of really make clear that there are very film-specific ways in which people process these film-specific strategies. But other media, of course, are importantly like film in this way, in that they've built up their own bundles of conventions that arise not to fit the dictates of logic, right, to narrative logic, but to produce particular effects. So a combination of, on the one hand, of opportunistic, promiscuous mobilization of whatever perceptual and cognitive tendencies we can find, they'll produce the effects we want. So on the one hand. On the other, historical and material contingencies that mean that some strategies are more practical, more conventional, more entrenched for one medium or one genre than another. Okay, so, but interestingly, the logic bit, you know, these structures and the conventions around them largely aren't driven by the dictates of, you know, sort of what narrative logic should hold, or real world reasoning about this, but the logic bit can come back in sometimes post facto to underwrite narrative exploits and twists. So that's important to keep in mind. And now that we know more about how continuity devices are processed by film viewers, we can see a little more clearly what elements of traditional textual narratives really are analogous to devices and structures in film. So those of you who work on narrative, viewpoint, and language have probably noticed by now that the conventions of continuity editing have a ton in common with many viewpointed constructions on the sentence level. That they can be partial, that they can be fleeting, that they can, you know, shift back and forth in these kinds of ways, and that they manage our sense of continuity without necessarily leaving a trace of feeling that a viewpoint has been full-fledgedly invoked. So in other words, so what I want to say is that, in other words, viewpoint and language often works as a continuity system. This is sort of the pitch that I want to make, is that this is a useful way to think about this as a tool for facilitating coherence and event understanding, as much as, or as more than a full-fledged depiction of embedded subjective attitudes. As far as I know, these sorts of structures in language are not usually considered as like a case of an extension of the category of continuity systems, but I think it could be really useful to do so. And finally, I want to talk about the flip side of the vanishability, if I may, of these cinematic viewpoints. They're latent, but available for decompression, as we can see sometimes through these examples of narrative twists that call back to them, jokes and other kinds of plays when the latent viewpointedness is brought to the fore and foregrounded as a source of, you know, to trigger a reinterpretation in some way. But sometimes it really takes a lot of work, and sometimes I think we'll find it's too much, right? That you can't make it work, that they're too latent. So where that possibility breaks down, its limits and how those limits do and don't shift over time are a relatively underexplored subject for research at the intersection of cognitive science and the humanities that we're just starting to try to do more with. Okay, I have a little bonus methodological point, but I'm over time, so we can talk about this later. But just about, well, we can talk about it later because I don't want to dwell on this too much. So thank you.